Okay, welcome to this very special Meet the Miniaturist live stream. How is everybody doing out there? I'm going to keep the comments stream open, so if you have any comments, please say hello in there in the chat box. Tell me where you are joining from. I'm going to give you a little bit of an update of what's happening before we bring up my special guest. So welcome to this live stream, Meet the Miniaturist. If you're joining, we're on Facebook Live right now. We're also on YouTube. So do say hello in the comment section. Tell me where you're joining from. I'm also going to pop in the important links for today's live stream that you might want to tap into, including my own links as well as my guest, who I'm going to talk about bring up in a second. But before we do that, let me take you through some of the things that are happening. I've had a couple of other Meet the Miniaturists that have been posted on my YouTube channel. Again, check out the links in the comment section. I had Taylor Laffensweiler from House of Vidian Miniatures. Check out that live stream. He's really a talented maker. He knows his way around a wood strip cutter. Very, very talented graphic artist by trade, but all of those talents come into play in all of the room boxes and dollhouses that he's building. So check out his work, Brooklyn-based. I also had a guest from Seattle, Rosetta Greek. She's actually the lead makeup artist with the Seattle Opera by day, but she's in the middle of this awesome refurbishing of a Beacon Hill dollhouse from a kit. She's also got amazing skills and talents in her building and her skills. And then finally, again, I mean, just the Jeff Swim from Doodler's Workshop. He's got an amazing garage workshop, and he knows his way around specialty woods, hardwoods, and things that work. So I had a great Meet the Miniaturist with him. Check that out again on my YouTube channel. You're going to want to go and like and subscribe and comment and do all of those awesome things. And last and most importantly, I do have a summertime estate sale that's happening right now. So go check out that. Link is in the comments. There's about 100 lots with some really interesting miniatures. Most are from a collector in Japan with over 50 years of collecting that she's looking to downsize. So this is the first of many. She tells me she has a huge collection. So this is the first of many sales that I will be hosting over the next several months. But there are a number of Japanese artists which are very unique to the U.S. market. They're more harder to find artists and pieces. So look for that, as well as beautiful porcelain and pottery. And just go check that out. Lots of yummy, yummy miniatures that are on auction right now. Again, bidding ends on Sunday at 7 p.m. in my eBay store. So check that out. And if you're looking to downsize, or if you're looking to sell a collection or work with someone who can find happy homes for your treasures, do reach out, direct message me, and we can chat. So, the other thing that's part of the sale is there are a lot of vintage Best Pack pieces, harder to find, earlier pieces by Best Pack, really good designs, great proportions. It's really some really special pieces. So check that out. And with that, I would like to bring up my special guest, which is Daniel from the UK. He's actually now in London, but you're based in, are from Spain. But just, so I'm going to let you introduce yourself, but the net is you have created this Disobedient Dollhouse. And we're going to talk a lot about what that means, but it really stems from all of your studies, emerging from your PhD studies and your thesis. So we're going to talk all about how this ultimately plays into the Disobedient Dollhouse behind you. And then we're going to do a deep dive to find out more about that dollhouse. So thank you for joining, Daniel. Tell us a little bit about yourself and where you how this all got started with miniatures, because I know you're an architect by trade. So all that.
Thank you so much. That's such a kind introduction. Yes, I'm Daniel. I'm from Spain, but I've lived in London for the last 13 years. I've been here for a while now. And how did I get started with miniatures? I guess when you train as an architect, you pretty much work through miniatures. when you're building models since the very beginning. At the beginning, quite rough, and then they sort of become more sophisticated as you get
Yeah.
better at it.
Yeah.
And the idea of the miniature is continuously there in the way you work. But this is the biggest thing I've definitely built, at least since my masters, and
Yeah.
and I think it's the one that's a bit closer to a doll's house than um, than an architecture model for lots of different reasons, and in a way, it's been like really helpful as part of my PhD research here at the Bartlett School of Architecture in London to be able to make something of this scale and this ambition alongside the other forms of research
Yeah.
that I'm currently working with.
Yeah. So you're an architect, that full stop, but you're also
Hmm.
an associate professor and you teach architecture, correct?
Yeah,
And so the PH studies, the PH studies is the first time sort of you brought doll houses into your world after working mostly with architectural models. So,
exactly.
and the differences between those two are very integral to your thesis. You know, the use of the dollhouse versus an architectural model are very important. And I wanted to talk to you about those differences, but set this up for us. Your thesis, what started the thinking behind it? I know you're very social justice engaged, or what would you say
I
is your
think
interest level?
I think at the moment, perhaps all of these nomenclature sort of like change a lot of the time. There's a lot of people have referred to the field as inclusive design, and that terminology has its own critique. Many people nowadays use the term spatial justice as a way of understanding that any space that we inhabit and design always carries with it justices and injustices that are
Can you
prevalent
just
elsewhere
repeat that?
elsewhere in society.
Would you just repeat that again? What was the nomenclature? The special
So typically nowadays, this sort of like field is referred to as spatial justice.
spatial justice. Again, that's really key to your thesis.
So the idea behind spatial justice is understanding that any space that we inhabit or design carries with it uh, injustices around gender diversity or racial diversity or sexual diversity that exist elsewhere in society, and those manifest themselves in
Justice.
space.
Wow. And your specific spatial justice is around LGBTQ plus families, correct? And that's
Correct.
maybe your cause to heart, maybe. I mean, why that? I mean,
Well, I'm a gay man myself, and I've always been sort of like interested in how people inhabit space, and specifically in domestic spaces, throughout my studies and
yeah.
in practice as well. Um,
Mhm.
but then when I started sort of like getting a bit more involved into queer studies and gender and sexuality studies, particularly when it applies to space and architecture, it's a field that is incredibly rich. It has been going on for decades. We can look back to the 1970s when human geographers started to look at neighborhoods with gay and lesbian people were living, and they were building spaces in the city that were intrinsically theirs and intrinsically queer. So because I'm my position is because the field of queer studies, and particularly when it applies to queer spaces, has this sort of like inception in a sort of like more urban scale with lots of scholars from human geography, urbanists, and so on. It has always paid more attention to streetscapes, nightclubs, community and commercial venues, and a lot less perhaps to the everyday spaces of
To domestic.
domesticity.
To
So I was really interested on, yes, perhaps adding to that scholarship of a queer space that has a very long tradition, but really do bring my interest in domesticity, both as an architect, but just like since I was very very little with any sort of like construction
Yeah.
game I got. It was always about houses and domesticity. But
Yeah.
also I think it's important to say that within this broader field of queer studying queer spaces in the last say 10 years, there's really been I'm not alone in this. There's really been a sort of a domestic turn into really looking at how LGBTQ plus people inhabit their homes and build their queer lives at home.
Yeah. Okay. So set up your thinking behind this, behind your research that led you to build the dollhouse to help, build your thesis and also um defend it. Yeah.
Well, I've not defended it yet, but I've
Oh,
still got a couple more years in
really?
the bank. But the reason why this came about was at the beginning of any PhD, you immerse yourself in the field and you sort of like try to find a niche, and so that involves what we call literature review, a lot of reading and sort of like reflecting on that reading. And as a scholar interested in practicing in an architecture school and using design tools and interested in domesticity and queerness, I was essentially reading a lot of recollections of LGBTQ plus people in their homes and at home from all sorts of fields. I was reading architectural historians, but also English literature scholars like Matt Cook, for instance, has an amazing book called Queer Domesticities, and it retells case studies of LGBTQ people at home in London and in different periods of the last 200 years. And in a way, after a whole sort of like academic year of a lot of reading of other people's research on this topic, I felt that my reflections as someone who practices design and someone who's in a design-led a PhD program, those reflections couldn't just be an essay or a think piece. They needed to take some sort of like more tangible and designed output. And that's how the dollhouse came about. I started building sort of like quite small, but things really got out of hand really, really quickly. And the dollhouse was in a way my personal way on reflecting on all of those spaces from different geographic locations, from different times in history, but with all had in common the homes of LGBTQ plus people I have read about. So there's a little bit of all of those homes and histories in the different details and rooms of the house. But of course, there's also a lot of my own reflection and interpretation of those spaces.
Right, right. So the inspiration came about from your reading, from your research, and also from meeting folks or everyday folks. Did that come
Not
in?
yet. That is what's coming. That is what's coming next. The part of my research I'm working on right now. I'm out in the field in London and I'm interviewing people in their own homes and trying to understand how their LGBTQ plus life happens in homes that are typically not designed with
Mhm.
queer lives and lifestyles in mind. And the idea that at the end of it there will be some, perhaps one or two more dolls houses that
Yeah,
reflect not just on historic
yeah,
examples, but on what's going on nowadays in LGBTQ plus Londoners' domesticities.
yeah. And so ultimately, the goal is to improve the lives of these people in some way. Um,
So I think this is a really interesting question because it's in every PhD student's mindset. It's always like, what is the point? What is the role of my, or what is the impact? And then when I finish my PhD, hopefully and go off to ask for
yeah,
like grant money to carry on researching, my potential funders are going to be asking, what is the impact? Um, to me, the impact is actually about practice, and that is where dolls houses versus architecture models have a
uh-huh.
lot to say. Um, the reason why I'm interested in understanding how LGBTQ plus people are living in today's London and in its housing stock It's because most of this housing is designed through codes and standards that typically don't have queer lives as part of their input. And I am personally quite critical of standards and codes in the way they constrain designers, and sort of like um, um, really constrain the variation and possibilities that our design training really would allow us to do. Typically, standards are there for some other reason, are for maybe controlling developers' greed and making sure they don't make everyone live in a
Right.
shoebox. And my point is that they are a blunt tool to do that. And what we get instead is housing that is so generic that it doesn't really fit anyone. And what I want to propose is like different, more open-ended ways of designing homes
Yeah.
that precisely are able to include so many more perspectives into the outcomes we get
Yeah.
from housing.
Yeah. So I want to tell folks that you were invited to write an article for Architects Journal in the UK, which is the premier architects magazine, correct? And for their premiere, for the first time they've ever sort of done a Pride issue, correct?
Yes.
So I want people to know that that's also in the links, by the way. So in that article, you talk about this urgent need in some way to get this going. Talk a little bit about that and why you feel like there's this more of a need to have this done more quickly. Is that yeah?
Well, I think there is definitely an urgency around housing, not just in London and in the UK, but I feel like across the West, like we hear about housing crisis in pretty much any so-called developed country, but also like in lots of cities in so-called developing countries. How the housing crises are also taking place. And in all of those discussions, we tend to prioritize quantity, so the amount of units that we can put out into the market. And I feel that very often that precludes conversations about the qualities of that housing. And obviously, my entry point into this is about inclusion of LGBTQ plus people, but I think this is a very much an intersectional matter. Um, if we keep just like pumping houses into the market to try to solve a housing crisis, but we don't really think about how we're designing them, we're definitely not going to be able to include how families are changing so fast. But also, if we don't really think about how we're delivering those houses, we're going to be overshooting our our carbon targets just by housing the country's population. So I think we really need a reset in how we think about housing, not so much focus on like how many houses we need, but actually the quality of the houses
Right.
that we're producing. And that's why I think the standard is a very blunt tool to get this done, because the standard essentially tries to codify into a minimum set of requirements what a house is. But what a house is something a lot more complex, a lot more variable.
Right. Right. So let's talk about the model versus dollhouse. Could you clearly chose to use dollhouse to help back up your thesis. What are some of the differences? Because you could have done an architectural model, right? At the end of the day, talk a little bit about that, and then let's get to some of your design inspirations, how you got to this structure behind you, which is so awesome.
So I guess yes, I could have done an architectural model, and I think part of this comes from my own teaching here at the Bartlett. Building a dollhouse has been our brief for the sort of like first exercise for our students in the studio that I run here with my teaching partner, Professor Izaskun Chinchilla. Um, just because building a dollhouse, or we've also done paper theaters, we've also done friendship pavilions, but essentially starting the year with a relatively small scale space, but built at a relatively large modeling scales, get students thinking about finishes and details and elements that are really important for user experience from the very beginning of the design
Yeah.
um, process. And this, in a way, this help us short circuit
Yeah.
the students' thinking, because typically when architects get given a brief, um, 9 times out of ten, the first thing you do is like build a model of the site, perhaps, or draw a site plan that is
Yeah.
maybe at scale 1 to 1,000 or 1 to 2,000. So in a way, we start from far away and then we get closer to that project. That, I think, in professional practice, that is typically not a problematic path to follow. In my opinion, perhaps it may not be the path I follow, but I don't think it's a problematic path either. That's because in practice we have things like typology. So you know from the beginning that you're designing, say, an office building. So there's a lot of parameters, design parameters you already know about the details of that typology. That means that you can start from that far away. But in architecture school, we precisely want the students to operate outside those parameters a lot of the time, or innovate or critique those parameters. And that's why we need, in our opinion, we need them to start
Yeah.
from the inside out and from the small scale, from the detail, from the handle, from the chair, from the corners, and so on. So a few years ago, building a 1 to 12 dollhouse was the first exercise that we set our students, our master students, and it was incredibly successful. So it was at the end of that year that I have finished my first year of literature review. And as I started making and reflecting onto all of these spaces, I thought, hang on, why don't I just work at 1 to 12, since it worked so well for the students a few months ago? And then alongside all of that work at 1 to 12, I was reading alongside about what what have architects or people who study architecture um, written about those houses and how they relate to architectural models. And a lot of that writing was incredibly inspirational and sort of like really highlighted to me the potential of working at this scale and in this particular way of working that you do when you build dolls houses, to my project that is all about diversity and inclusion.
Yeah. Yeah. So, where did you begin with this doll's house, and why is it called the Disobedient Dollhouse?
So, I mean, it it began in the facade, which is quite contradictory relative to what I've just said, because we have this idea of prioritizing interiors starting from the inside out. Pardon me. But structurally, I kind of needed the base and the facade to go first. So that was the first bits that I built. And the idea of disobedient is came a lot later, and it's sort of like twofold. Um, on the one hand, disobedience is relevant to the research, because a lot of the LGBT people, LGBTQ plus people that I was reading about, they were disobeying the norms of domesticity in the way they were living, and and in many of those cases, that disobedience was at the core of why a sociologist or an architectural historian had studied them in the first place. So that was one point of disobedience. But another point of disobedience, and this is like entirely borrowed from Paulette Singley, who's an architecture historian. She wrote a journal article a few years ago about how dolls' houses are misbehaving objects in a way, particularly when you compare them with an architectural model, because in a way they disobey a lot of the conventions in architectural model making that we get taught in architecture school. So it
Like,
was like that
can
twofold sorry, that twofold disobedience
so just
was really interesting to me.
talk about what are those differences from
So
that
a
makes it
key
disobedient?
a key one is about narrative and structure. I don't know. I think structure is fairly, to me, it's quite clear in this dollhouse, although it's a little bit confusing and over the top. But it's fairly clear. But typically in those houses, we prioritize something else. We prioritize the potential for narrative.
Uh-huh.
Um, in a doll's house. So for instance, they're always like openable in some way or shown directly open so you can see the entire section. And the idea is that almost like each room is almost a vignette where you can tell a story or a series of vignettes that can join together into a story. And that capacity for narrative is typically prioritized in the way you build over, let's say, make a very clear and rational structure expressing the structure. If this was an architectural model, I would be quite likely stripping off half of the finishes and furniture so you can actually see how the structure
Right.
is working. But doll houses tend to prioritize that narrative aspect because again, narrative is key to
Yeah.
their function since their very beginning.
I would say just like for me personally is, I look at architectural model, I don't get the same emotional,
Mm,
I don't have that same emotional, attachment or emotional, any kind of feeling that you might get from a model versus dollhouse. So that for me, that would be the biggest difference. Um, so let's take a look at this. Let's take a look. I brought up the slideshow of a much more deeper dive into the structure itself. Can we talk about all of the elements and what are the materials you use? Maybe a little bit about the techniques you employed.
so this is where I think when I started this doll's house, my obviously my training as a maker was very much in workshops in architecture schools. Um, I had I had used a workshop that wasn't an architecture school before for furniture making, but other than that, every workshop that I had used was within an architecture school. That means a very specific selection of materials and tools. For instance, things that sound like very over the top, um, technically like laser cutters or 3D printers are very accessible to
Mhm.
me, and it's a huge privilege. And also materials such as plywood or in any sort of like thickness, all the way to like 0.5 millimeters, is very accessible for us. And so is acrylic. So there's a lot of plywood and acrylic throughout, but also lots of just outright model making material. Like most of the vertical posts are just like ready-made 5 millimeters by 5 millimeter posts
Yeah,
that you would use for model making structural frames. And what I'm doing is bunching four of them together with a small acrylic piece that is
yeah,
sort of like made in a sort of like toy-like, quite fun way. And
yeah.
that's what builds up half of the most of the structure of the doll's house. Um, I think as this started to evolve, as the model started to evolve and started to become and look more like um, a doll's house, I realized that that material palette was limited, and I had to start stepping out of the world of an architecture school repertoire
Uh-huh.
and start looking elsewhere. And it all went into all sorts of like hobbies and crafts, kind of materials that are typically not available in
Yeah,
an architecture school workshop. Things like, I don't know, mirrored acrylic that I've used over there,
yeah,
or stick-on velvet like
yeah,
I've got in the lower ground. And I think that's where the journey started sort of like diverging even more and more into the doll's house territory until I ended up buying things like picture frames
yeah,
off of a dollhouse marketplaces online, and in the end, a lot of the sort of like smaller objects, such as like jugs, cups,
yeah.
books, and things like that. They all came from specialist sort of like dollhouse supplier at a time where it was like my first time ever delving into that world. So it was a very a random
Yeah.
selection of materials, and then sort of like the more I've become acquainted with you guys,
Yeah.
well, I understand what an infinite sort of like array. of objects you can get at 1 to 12 for your doll's house.
Yeah. I'm struck by how it comes off as an art piece. And I don't know if that was your intent, but that's ultimately what attracted me to the dollhouse is it does straddle that traditional dollhouse because there's 2 floors and there are rooms, but the way it's put together is quite artful. Was that your intent as part of this? And has it been received that way? Because I know it's been on exhibition.
It has been, yes, it has been exhibited. I'm not sure. I'm
And
not
do you
sure if,
want it to be received that way? I guess that's the other question, right? And that's was it that if you weren't intending for it to happen, that's how I see
I think people like looking at it.
it. Uh-huh.
Um, which always bothers me a little bit because I would love for people to interact with it a little bit more.
Okay.
I actually have the best time with it when I'm building it. And today, before meeting with you, I was doing some final touches because as I mentioned earlier before we started the live, I had an event elsewhere on campus in the anthropology department, and let's say she doesn't travel very well, so
Yeah.
she needed a few bits of repair here and there, and then obviously laying out all of the furniture and objects. That is what I enjoy the most of the doll's house. But other people seem to just like want to look at it and
Yeah.
not really dare to touch anything, which I always feel like, oh, there's something wrong in the design if people don't really feel the urge to interact with it because I would love for it to be
Well,
quite
that's because it's an art
interactive.
piece. I would be afraid to touch it. I wouldn't touch it. I mean, that's a testament to the fact that it
Mm.
is, hands off. Don't touch this. Everything is so perfectly put together, and you know.
But I think that's where I feel it maybe fails a little bit as a research tool
Oh,
because as I'm doing a PhD that is so people orientated,
uh-huh.
and a tool like this that is part of the research should be quite approachable and interactive. And I think part of what I'm thinking about is, okay, how can I take versions of this into the field, into my interviews, or perhaps in workshops, but in a format that really people feel like they can interact with? Because obviously these are my reflections
Yeah.
based on a year of reading, but my PhD is ultimately more interested in other people's, a wider range of people's reflections on domesticity and their queerness.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, I hear you. I hear what you're saying. It's tough though because it is such a beautiful piece. So does this reflect your personal style? Or you mentioned that a lot of this has come out of your research, but
Mm.
does it reflect any? I mean, is there personal touches in there that reflect who you are?
I think there's definitely personal touches. There's a lot of furniture that I like.
Hmm.
There's some furniture that I own. Um, I mean, the bathroom. I would really love to have a bathroom like the one in the in the doll's house. And indeed, it's sort of like based in a bathroom that actually existed um, um, Alan Buchsbaum apartment in New York City.
Uh-huh.
With again always with my own sort of like inner intervention. Um, but yeah, I think a lot of it is like the things that I like and taken a little bit over the top. And in a way, this is part of what the role of those houses is as well. When they were originally 300 years ago, when people started building those houses in Europe, they were about a nostalgia for kind of like way of domestic living from the past, and a way of like, and as a signifier of wealth to sort of like show off your wealth. I kind of feel like a lot of the time miniatures like these nowadays allow people to explore the things that we cannot have. Perhaps the suburban homes that our parents could afford and that we can't afford, and so
Right.
you sort of like end up daydreaming about those through miniatures.
Yeah. I mean, in a way, isn't that a lot about what you're trying to do, is to show people what can be? You know, with how people interact with dollhouses, it's all about what can be. Maybe you can't have it right now, but you know, you got to put it out there and show it,
Exactly.
and then you get there. So what? So I didn't realize. I thought you were sort of on the. I thought you were getting ready to sort of present this. So there's still more that has to be done. So talk a little bit about
Yes.
those pieces, and then what does that include?
So at the moment, I am in the middle or trying to conclude and wrap up one-to-one interviews with LGBTQ plus Londoners in their homes. And for each of those interviews, I sort of like draw a drawing that has ended up quite inspired by those houses as well, of how they're living in their existing home. And the next phase in the field also involves people, but the idea is, as I was saying, to bring um, a toolkit, something that resembles a dollhouse, but it's not fully built, so people can sort of like finish the build and personalize to a series of workshops. I'm planning at least 3 workshops over the next year or so.
Wow.
But still working at 1 to 12, because I really think that scale
Yeah.
has an amazing power to really immerse you in those domestic spaces. So the
Yeah.
idea is that I'll organize these workshops, and participants are able to think about their domesticity in a sort of like more forward-looking, or
Yeah.
maybe like daydreaming or utopian way, and sort of like build a room or maybe two, and then we can put them together collectively into a doll's house.
Yeah. Well, I think that's awesome, and we will be watching. So you say that there might be more dollhouses to come.
Yes.
So we will be watching you, and you have an Instagram account, right? It's tell us what the name is.
The handle is at queerdom canon, which is like sort of like merged together of queer domestic canon, which is the title of my dissertation. And in there you can see some work in progress of
Yeah.
when I was building the dollhouse. You can learn a little bit more about some of the examples and case studies that inspired this dollhouse. And I also upload whenever I'm looking for participants for interviews and workshops.
Right.
For anyone who's in London, I upload any updates over there.
That's awesome. All right, so I popped that in. So we'll follow you there. We'll continue to follow you and all of your work moving up forward, which I think is fantastic.
Thank you.
The design work is fantastic. Everything you're doing is really great. So really, really, thank you for all that. All what you're doing to sort of merge the worlds in a way, because I mean, we've always known there's architecture, design, dollhouse. We knew that there were places for each of them and they interplayed, but I don't think it's ever been put this closely, like to really show that this is how these categories align. So thank you for what you're doing. We'll be following closely.
Thank you.
And thank you for being on today. And thank you everybody at home for watching. Have a great rest of your day. And thanks again,
Fantastic. Thank you,
Daniel.
Darren.
All right, take care. Bye.
Bye.